Okay, this is part 2. So what we've got to do here is get that information that the form sent and use the data from the form to create a record or change a record. So what we are going to need to do is we're going to create the form that's called change student grade, because that's what we said the action would be in our form. We're going to get the student code, the module code and the grade from the request stream from that form. We'll connect to the database and then we'll have to process the record in some way, in order to insert it or update it. And I guess there's a few ways we could do that. We could add a new record, but what about if that record's already there? You know what I mean? Because that student has already got a grade, but we need to change it. So we could try and add a new record, and then if there's an error when we try and add a new record, because don't forget we'll have a primary key that would stop duplicates, so we wouldn't be allowed to add a record with the same primary key values, and the primary key is student code and module code. So if we try and add a record and get an error, then in which case we can't create a new record, so what we'll do is update a record instead. So that's one scenario we could do that. Or instead of doing that, we could try and reverse it, not add a new record, and if we get an error, update it. We could try and update a record, but if there's not one there, that'll be slightly different, because we won't get an error, but there is a way of testing whether or not that update affected any records. And if when we try and update it, it didn't affect any records, then what we'll do is we'll insert it instead. So that's kind of a similar approach. In actual fact, doing a bit of reading, it would appear that that's a slightly faster approach than doing an insert and then an update. It's slightly faster to do an update and then an insert. So in actual fact, that's what we'll do. But there's another way of doing it, and this is what I used to do for years instead, is we could, if we've got the primary keys, i.e. student code and module code, we could construct a select statement, select whatever from our table, where the student code equals whatever was in the form and the module code equals whatever is in the form. And then if we get a record back, we know there is already a record, so we could carry out an update statement. And if we didn't get a record back, we'd carry out an insert statement. And that's, as I say, what I used to do. The slight disadvantage of that is that you always do more statements. Do you know what I mean? Because you have to do a select and then you do an update, or you select and then you do an insert. Whereas this way, there is a possibility that we get it right first time and we only do one statement, we just update. But either of these ways would work. It's just a question of choosing one and coding it. And then if you realize you've chosen incorrectly, well, you just code a different one. So that's our kind of overall plan of action. So let's look in slightly more detail of what that will involve. So we're going to do the same as we did before. We'll display the errors. We're going to connect to a database. We'll retrieve the data from the request stream. If the data is okay, because there's no point in going on and doing stuff if it's not, and by the way, to some extent, it might have been better to connect to the database if the data was okay, rather than beforehand. In fact, I think I'll do that. I'll move that from there to there instead, and we'll only connect to the database if the data is okay that we got from the request stream. We'll make some SQL statements because we potentially need to make an update and an insert one, and then we'll try and execute the query, and we'll figure this out in the process. I can explain this try catch construct. If the data was not okay, else we're going to give an error message, and we provide, in any event, whether it was okay or not okay, a link back to the form. Okay, so that's my plan of action. So I'm going to copy that from there, and I'll go to my change student grade code, and what I'm going to do is paste in that plan. Okay, so display errors. Well, we did that before, didn't we? So I'll just take the code that I've got off screen and copy that. And now I'm going to retrieve the data from the request stream. So how do I do that? Well, a simple way is you just simply make up a variable. Let's do it with one. Student code equals, and if the method on the form is get, you will find that the data is in an array, an associative array called get, and it's also in an associative array called request. if we change the method on the form to post, then it's in an associative array called post when I eventually type it, or it's in that same array called request, which means a lot of the time actually I just make it request, because it means I don't need, if I change the form from get to post, I don't also need to change the script. And it was called on the form student code, exactly the same. By the way, what's in the request is whatever you named it on the form. It's important to realize that if you name it student code, that's what is in the request stream. So personally, I always make sure the things on the form are named the same as they are in the database, and then the variables here are named exactly the same. I don't call them different things because it's just, you know, an accident waiting to happen. So let's just try that. I'll save that bit of code, and actually let's just write echo code is student code, just a quick demonstration of something. So I'll refresh that page. Okay, and it says code is that, because it got the student code from the request stream. Now, what would happen though if someone removed that because they'd looked at your form and thought, oh, the action of that is called change student grade? What happens now if I call that with no student code passed? Well, I get an error. Undefined index student code in the file that's called that on line 15. And the reason for that is because on line 15 I said blithely, go and get that from the request stream. Well, it's not in the request stream. So that's the first thing, is you should never just try and get something from the request stream. You should do it defensively. Now, there's a great programming structure in a lot of programming languages called the ternary if. And the way the ternary if works is that you give a value and you set that value to equal some test. And if that test returns true, then you store whatever the true value is. Else you store whatever you want to store if it's false, the false value. Except we don't say then, we say question mark. Whoever thought of this, I don't know. And instead of else, we put in a colon. So that's the structure we'll use. It's called a ternary if, and I'll just comment that just so it doesn't make everything go strange. Now, and I'll just cut that. So, what's the test? Well, the test is it set that thing? If that thing is set, then I'm going to store as the true value that thing that's in the request. Else, if it's not true, what I'm going to store is null. So in other words, student code will either equal that if it's in the request stream or null if it's not. Let's see the difference in that code. So I'll refresh that page. There's nothing in the request stream, and what you'll notice is that error message will disappear, and what it's now echoing is null. Whereas if I put it back in the request stream, which I can do with that, just by pressing back arrow, then it echoes it out. So I've got a much cleaner way of doing things. So I'm going to copy that code, I'll remove that for debugging. I'll copy that and paste it 3 times, except I don't want student code. I want module code. And I don't want student code. I want grade, I think I called it. Okay, so I've got the data, so now I need to check if the data's okay. Well, that's easy to do because I've assigned null to it. I can just use a great function called empty. So I can say if, actually what I mean is if it's not empty. So if it's not empty, the thing called student code, and it's not empty, the thing that's called module code, then we're quids in. Okay, and everything's all right. So where's that else statement? So I'll do that there, another else, brackets, give an error message. I don't need to comment that with else, but just help me get the logic correct. So if it's not empty, then it's going to do something, otherwise it will give an error message. Well, let's put in the error message straight away. Echo, sorry, you must enter student and major mark information. Notice how I'm trying to write legal HTML by including that in a paragraph, because that would be an inline element and it needs to be inside a block element. So let's just save that and see how that works. So I do that and I should see nothing. Okay, but if I remove that at the end, then the data is empty and I should see my error message. Sorry, you must enter student and module information. So far so good. Okay, so now let's move on to the next bit of things I've got to do. I'll indent that. Right, connect to the database. Make up some SQL statements. Well, if you remember, I need to make up two SQL statements. One where it's going to update things and one where it's going to insert things. So that's what I'm going to do. But what I'm doing is updating student module. I'm going to set the grade to equal that. In my data I've got something called end date, but I won't bother. And I'm going to set the grade to equal that, where the module code equals that and the student code equals that. Okay. So that would be my update SQL, and I always test that out, and I've similarly done that on the database exactly as I explained to you before, by going to here and I can just try out some SQL here. Because I've got the table in question. This is the intersection table between students and modules, because each student is on many modules and each module is studied by many students. So I've got an intersection table that contains the key field from both participating table plus some extra information, so in this case the grade. And I've also got start date and end date, which you don't need for this example. Or my insert, which is insert into that. And again, I won't bother inserting end date and these values. Okay, now in actual fact, this isn't in any way secure, look, because I'm just getting the variable and I'm putting it straight into the database. That's not a good thing to do. In a future screencast, we'll find better ways to do that. There are two ways. One, you can use a method called quote, where at least you can escape things like apostrophes and whatever, because in actual fact if a student had a name like O'Brien, it would cause your application to crash. Or we could use prepared statements, which is better still, but I'll cover that in a future screencast. So just bear in mind, this isn't code that you should really write and have in production without some more modifications to check this data is okay before you go and executing a query. You should never execute a query using data that you've got from the outside world, even if you think it's come from a form which you've created, because a user can look at the form and miss it out altogether. So we've got two sets of SQL, some update and some insert. So what we're going to try and do is carry out that update statement first of all. So let's first of all use this nice try structure. So let's try. Then what happens is we can catch any errors. Okay, so what we can catch in there is a particular sort of error, and you can be quite specific about the error that you catch. There's PDO exceptions, there's maths exceptions, there's all sorts, but here I'm just catching any exception whatsoever, whatever, any error that's taken place. And what it does is catch the error or exception and gives it to you as a variable, which we can call anything we want. I can call it EX or exception, but usually I just call it E because I'm just a bit lazy, and that's the convention I've invented for myself, that E stands for errors or exceptions. And then in here we can refer to that. So if there were an exception, I can echo out what the exception was. We'll come to that in a bit. So here what I'm going to do then is I'm going to try and execute the query in question. So I'm going to make up a variable called statement, and I'm going to say that what that is that it's my database, and I'm going to call query, and I'm going to try and do that SQL update statement. SQL update. Okay, so it'll try and do that update statement. Now, when we do an insert or a select or a delete, I missed out something there. When we do an update or a select or a delete, we've got something called row count, which tells us how many rows are affected by the previous query. So let's make up a variable called rows updated and set it equal to our statement object, and calling the method that is row count. And what that will do is tell us how many rows were affected. Well, if there was already a student record which we've successfully updated, then it will give us 1, presumably, as the answer to how many rows are updated. But if it gives us 0, it will indicate to us that actually there were no students like that. So what we need to do is do an insert statement instead. So let's write some code for that. That if something else something. Okay, if what? Well, if the rows updated were greater than 0, it means we succeeded. So let's think positively, and rows updated was greater than 0. It means we did successfully update something. So let's give them a message back. We could echo a message back of some description. Tell you what, let's give them a useful message. Okay, so our useful message is student, whatever the code word was, had grade for whatever that is changed to whatever that is. So it'll say student L57 had the grade for module, blah blah blah, changed to B or whatever. But if rows updated wasn't greater than 0, it means instead what we've got to do is do our insert statement instead. So let's do that. So let's use the same statement variable equals GB query. So we call the query method, and we pass to it instead our SQL insert SQL from up here. So we insert it instead. Okay, so it'll either update or it will insert. If we try and update first of all, if we succeeded, we give them a message back. If we didn't succeed, it meant there must have already been a record, so nothing. There must not have been a record, so there was nothing to update. So instead, what we do is we do the insert statement that we've written out there instead. So that only leaves the possibility that either one of those messed up for some other reason altogether. So we might want to echo a message saying, sorry, error updating, error or changing grade. We need to be slightly careful what we tell a user, but at this stage it's important for us to get some idea of any possible errors in our code so that we can correct them. So the other thing I'm going to do then is write a message that will give some indication of what the error might have been using this error object that I've got here. So error was the get message I'll concatenate on the end of that, the end paragraph. Okay, so if there was an error, it will say, sorry, there was an error, and then it will say the error was whatever the message was, the error message. So, it could be that it's some violation of the data or whatever, but that will tell us what that error is that got caught there. Hopefully we'll never see that, but that's a possibility. Right, finally we need to create a link back to the form. So echo in quotes ahref equals, what was it called, change student grade form.php. Should have been inside a paragraph because that's an inline element and it needs to be inside a block element. Okay, so is that everything? No, I've got to close PHP and I've got to end the body and then I've got to end the HTML. Okay, let's see how we get on. So let's choose Alfonso Pedro, Advanced Database Technologies, grade A. Let's make him fail. So F, set grade. Student whatnot had grade changed to F. Well, let's try that out. So I'm going to copy that, go to here, select everything from X student module where student code equals what I've just got on the clipboard. So let's see if the module, what was it called? If module CG096 is an F. Okay, let's try it out with another one. Let's change it to a B. Let's refresh that SQL and it's changed to a B. Okay, now let's choose one that's none of those. Let's go back to here and choose, I don't know which they are, so this might actually already be there, but let's try one, save grade. Okay, that didn't quite the same message, so something different happened, didn't it? So let's rerun that. Oh, and an extra record's just appeared somewhere or other. So the insert worked. So in short, I've tested everything's working and it seems okay. It's just that here I've said had grade changed to that, but here I didn't give a message, did I? It might have been better to give a message here as well. In fact, since the message changed, I'm inclined to make up a variable called message and set it to equal something and then echo what the message was right at the end, but I'll leave you to figure out what I've just been trying to say and do something appropriate. Echo new grade added, etc., and you'll give the appropriate message using the variables that you've got. So you get the idea of how that worked. So it's a creative process. You figure out what your approach will be, you code it and try and work out the logic, cope with any errors and correct them. And if when you've done all of that it doesn't work, well, you do it a different way and start again. It's a never-ending process, and as I'm doing this I'm thinking to myself, oh, it would be better if I did that and I didn't have that there and I moved that there and I had a variable for this. That's completely normal. It's the way things go. Okay, so in our next screencast what I'll try and look at is how to change some of these so they're a bit safer to use. I mean, actually I can just tell you that now, at least give you one brief example of it. So how about if I choose one, student code. So we've got a variable called student code, and instead of just leaving it as is, because at the moment it's come directly from the request stream, I can use db, and there's a method called quote, and you give it whatever it is you want to quote, which in this case is student code. So all I'm doing here, and I do that for each of those variables up there, all I'm doing here is getting the student code as it stands. I'm quoting it. In other words, what that'll do is take any apostrophes and put backslashes in front of them, or appropriate things, so they can be inserted into the database without causing any error. And I'm restoring that quoted string back into that variable, so that when I embed that variable here, at least it's safe to some extent. Okay, so you do one line like that for every variable that you're likely to interpret. A much more robust way is to use something called prepared statements, but that's a different topic altogether, which we'll look at elsewhere. That's it. Hope that was helpful to you. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.